Hey, third grade, it's Mrs. Seals back for our next science lab. So, we finished up what we call physical science, and that's what we've been doing in science since the beginning of the year: properties of matter, energy, force, and motion. All of that's what we call physical science. Starting now, for the next couple months, we're going to be doing what we call earth science. So, we're going to be talking about rocks and soil, water, natural resources, weather, all those sorts of things. So we're going to start, excuse me, we're going to start today by talking about something called weathering. So your target says I can explore and record how soils are formed by weathering of rock. So this is probably a new concept to you, unless you have learned about this outside of school, but I know third grade is the first year in school that you have learned about this. So make sure you're listening since this is brand new. So weathering is the breaking down and wearing away of rock. So let me go back to that. So the breaking down and wearing away of rock. So this is a process that happens that causes rocks to break down into smaller pieces or change size and shape. Okay, so these are things that we call slow changes. Weathering is a slow change. This is not something that will happen overnight. Think about rocks, they're very hard. A lot of them are very big. So if they are going to break down or change size or shape or wear away, it's going to take many, 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 many years. So these are slow changes. So today we're going to talk about some different ways that this can happen. So weathering can happen by four main what we call agents. Water is one of them. And in a minute, I'll show you and talk to you about some different ways that water can cause rocks to break down. Wind is another way, ice, and the fourth way is what we call mechanically. Oops, replaying the whole thing. Sorry. All right. So here is how water can cause weathering. Streams or rivers flowing over rocks over many, many years causes them to change size and shape. These rocks tend to be smoother. So if you've ever been to a river or a stream, someplace where the water is constantly flowing, you may have noticed that most of the rocks that you'll find at the bottom of the river or stream are very, very smooth and round. You don't find a lot of sharp and jagged rocks at the bottom of a river. That's because over many years of the water flowing over them, it has smoothed the rocks. We say it's wearing them away and made them into nice smooth shapes. Another way that water can cause weathering is by waves. Waves crashing into rocks over many, many years can wear it away over long periods of time. So think about rocks at the beach all day and all night for many, many years. They're being hit by waves as the waves come in. So when that happens over a long period of time, again, it can, as the waves go back out, they can pull some of the minerals or tiny pieces of rock with them. Also, waves can pick up other rocks and carry them with them and cause those rocks to crash into other rocks, and they can smash together. And again, when that happens over a period of many years, it can eventually cause the rocks to break apart or to wear down. So here are two pictures of where we see rocks being weathered by water. Here are some rocks where the river is flowing over them, smoothing them out. And then here are some rocks that are always being hit by the waves. All right, so water is one way that weathering can occur. Another way that weathering can occur is by wind. So wind causes weathering by blowing bits of material against cliffs and large rocks. This wears and breaks the rock down into sand and dust. So you will see this happen a lot in places like deserts or other places where there is a lot of sand, because what happens is when the wind blows, it picks up some of the sand and carries it, and that sand rubs up against the big rock or the cliff. So again, when this happens over a period of thousands or millions of years, it's almost like rubbing sandpaper up against that rocks. It kind of wears away at it and changes the shape and size of it. So this causes a landform called a rock arch. Here are some pictures of rock arches. A lot of people see these and think that these are man-made and that maybe an artist with a chainsaw went out there and made this sculpture. These are naturally occurring. These are caused by weathering from the wind. The wind picks up sand or other material, and as it blows, it rubs the sand or other material up against the large rock, and eventually kind of eats away or wears away at it, creating these formations. Another way that weathering can be caused is by ice. So this is called ice wedging. When water sinks into cracks in a rock and the temperature drops low enough, the water freezes into ice. When water freezes into ice, it expands and forms wedges in the rock that can split the rock into smaller fragments. So here's a little diagram that shows you again how this happens. So you have a rock, it rains or something, water collects in the rock in the crack, and then when the temperature drops low enough, that water freezes, and when water freezes, it expands, it gets bigger, so that kind of causes the crack to get bigger or wider. And then when it warms up, that ice melts or thaws and turns back into water, and then that water can seep deeper down into another crack. And then when that happens over and over and over again, you have that ice pushing apart. So the repeated expansion and contraction causes further cracks till the rock splits. So you'll see this a lot, not so much here because we don't get a lot of days in the winter where it freezes or it's super duper cold, but in places that are cold, very, very cold in the winter, you will see a lot of times the roads and the sidewalks have a lot of cracks and bumps in them, and they're just not in good shape. And that's caused by the ice, because this happens every winter and it causes the sidewalks and the roads to break apart. And then the fourth main way that weathering can happen, is mechanical weathering. And an example of this is called root wedging. So just like the ice wedging was the ice wedging its way down into the rock until it eventually breaks apart, same with root wedging. Plant roots work their way into rock crevices. As they grow, roots create pressure on the sides of the crack, enlarging it until the rocks break apart. So this happens. So here are two examples of this. You may have seen a sidewalk like this before that's right next to a really big tree, and the sidewalk kind of cracks and breaks apart. That's an example of root wedging. The roots of the tree are so strong that they can actually break apart the rock. All right, so what we're going to do today is we are going to do an experiment to observe how weathering can break down and wear away rock. And this is something you could maybe do at home. The only tools I need are a package of ramen noodles. This is going to represent our rock. And you need a piece of sandpaper and a nail and a plate, something to put it on. That's really all you need. So make sure if you do decide to do this, you have permission from a parent. The nail is sharp. I don't want anyone to get hurt. And, this is food, so I don't want you to waste food without your parents' permission. So we're going to, like I told you, this ramen kind of brick of noodles is going to represent our rock. And we're going to do 4 different things to it to kind of demonstrate or show different ways that rocks can be weathered. So first I'm going to break my ramen in half. There we go. It broke into more than 2 pieces, but that's okay. So the first thing we're going to do is called the ramen noodle grind. And this is going to represent one way that rocks can be weathered. So remember, we're pretending these are our rocks. So I'm going to take my 2 rocks and I'm going to grind them together. So I notice as I'm grinding them together, well, first I notice I'm making a mess, right? But I notice that little tiny pieces of rock are breaking off of the larger rock. And there's actually a name for that. The little tiny pieces of rock that are broken off of larger rocks are called sediment. And sediment is created from all these processes that we talked about. When rocks are broken down or worn away, it can create smaller rocks, smaller pieces that we call sediment. So I noticed that as these 2 larger rocks are grinding together, smaller pieces of rock are breaking apart. We call those sediment. The next thing I'm going to do to my ramen to my ramen noodles is use a nail. And all I'm going to do, I'm just going to take one of my pieces of ramen, I'm just going to poke it with my ramen, or with my nail. I'm going to poke my ramen with my nail. And I notice that as I poke into it, my larger rock broke apart into 2 smaller pieces of rock, and even some tinier pieces of rock called sediment broke apart. So this is an example. This could represent maybe the ice wedging or the root wedging that we talked about. The nail could represent either ice getting down into the crevices of rocks and over time breaking them apart, or it could represent the root from a plant growing through the rock and causing it to break apart. All right, the next little investigation is going to involve the sandpaper. So again, I'm going to just take one of my pieces of ramen. I think I might even kind of clear this out of the way so that you can see. I'm going to take one of my pieces of ramen and my sandpaper, and I'm just going to rub for a second. All right. So this is another way that weathering can occur. This is like the wind that I told you about, how the wind picks up the sand and blows it against the larger rock. And over time, it wears it down. It can change its size, its shape, its texture. I don't know if you can tell here where the sandpaper was rubbing is much smoother now. It has been worn away by the sandpaper. And also, look at the sediment that this is creating. Do you notice how this sediment is much smaller than the other sediment that we've created? It's almost like a dust or a powder. So this represents, again, the wind causing the rock to wear down and break apart in places like the desert or things that have a sandy environment. And then the last way to show weathering is called noodle drop. I'm going to just take a piece of ramen and drop it, and you can notice that pieces of it have broken apart. Pieces of the larger rock have broken into smaller pieces called sediment. So all of those little investigations with the ramen noodles were just to kind of show you more examples of how larger rocks can be broken down into smaller pieces and the different ways that that can happen. So I hope that you enjoyed learning about weathering and how rocks are broken down. Please remember that there's a short quiz after this video. It's not required, just for me to see what you learned. If you do this experiment at home, I would love to see it. You can take a picture or a video and send it to me. I hope that you guys had a good time, and I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.